Hello everyone, welcome back. I hope you've had a chance to finish up Module 2. So now we're going to dive into Module 3. And here we're going to be focusing on a bit more content. So we're going to be looking at the values and ethics in social work, our focus on human rights and social justice, how we approach diversity in social work, a little bit more on the empowerment process and how we use that to guide our practice, some of the social work functions and roles, and our work in the policy arena. And next, we're going to move on into really looking at some examples of what social work practice looks like. That'll be in Module 4 of social work practice across different fields. So I just briefly want to go over what we'll be discussing today. We'll be doing the reading review as usual, the key things you should be taking away from the chapter. And we're going to go into a bit more of the orientation of social work values, kind of the history where it comes from, as well as ethics. We're going to look at the main ethical principles of social work, and we're going to look at a few case examples of ethical dilemmas that social workers often face. So after you're finishing your reading and going through this e-class, you should be familiar with these key terms: values, the foundation of professional social work values, core values of social work, the value context, ethics, the NASW Code of Ethics, and ethical principles. If you're not familiar with these, make sure you review them before you take the quiz at the end of this module. So before we dive into the content on social work values and ethics, I think it's important for us just to reflect back and kind of pull some of these pieces together. So if you remember back at the end of chapter 2, you read about the tenets of social work practice. And so this is really to help us understand how the purpose, values, knowledge, and skills of the profession translate into practice, social work practice. And these tenets of practice are really foundational to the core of a generalist social worker's practice. And they really, in many ways, are derived from or rooted in our values and ethics. And you'll see as we go through and really talk about the different, particularly the ethical principles, how these all kind of relate as we think about in terms of social workers being competent and focusing on social justice and the dignity and worth of a person. All of our practice and the approaches that we take to helping individuals, families, communities respond to difficulties are really rooted within our values and ethics. We use those to really decide how we approach practice with these different groups. So before we go into the material in more depth, I want you to take a few minutes to really reflect on these questions. And these reflections should really show up in your personal and your journals for the end of this module. So I'd like you to take a few minutes and write down your answers to the questions. What are your personal values? How did you develop them? And what would you do if your personal values conflicted that with those of your agency or your profession? So take a few minutes, write those down, and when you're ready, continue on with the video. So social workers, they're really four value and belief systems that guide our practice. And right here we've got the first three, and these are societal values and beliefs, personal values and beliefs, and professional and organizational values and beliefs. The final one, the fourth one, is the client's values and belief system, so what they bring to the table. Now, the societal values and beliefs, this is our most macro level, and they include kind of the social and cultural norms and assumptions of how people should function in society. And so some of the traditional societal values might be in terms of, the idea of everyone should go to college, or the most historical one, everyone should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. These ideas that are kind of ingrained within our society around how we should operate. And we've got our personal values and belief systems, which are often developed by our family, the culture of our family, any kind of other influences we have in terms of religious, spiritual as well. and also by our life experiences. So, our personal values and beliefs may change over time as we interact and reflect on new situations in life. And then we've got our professional organizational values and beliefs. So our profession and our organization kind of dictate how we should approach situations, how we should think about situations, and things like that. And then the clients come in with their own values and beliefs, just like we have our own values and beliefs developed from our family and our culture. The clients also will have those. And so, in the ideal world, all of these would fit together and there would be no ethical dilemmas, right? There would be no conflict between societal values and beliefs and our personal values and beliefs. However, this is often not the case. Particularly as social workers, when we work with individuals who are oppressed or who, are having difficulty accessing the resources they need to thrive, we often find that there's a conflict between societal values and beliefs about people and our own. For example, the idea of rugged individualism or pulling yourself up by your bootstraps suggests that anybody should be able to get themselves out of poverty if they just work hard enough. Well, as social workers, we know that that's just not true, and that's really just victim blaming. We recognize as social workers that environmental context plays a huge role in whether or not an individual and their family can access the resources they need to get out of poverty. And so again, there are times when there's congruence between beliefs and values, but often there are times when these come into conflict. And as social workers, we have to reflect critically um, when we see these ethical dilemmas arise. And particularly, we have to really be mindful of our personal values and belief systems, and when they come into conflict with those of the clients that we work with, or our organizational values and beliefs. And we really have to think critically about how we can work through these ethical dilemmas. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the ethical decisions and ethical decision making as we go through this e-class. So as social work professionals, we have a code of ethics which lays out our values as well as the ethical principles and standards that guide our practice. And so the code of ethics for social workers includes our preamble, which kind of gives the overview of social work, our purpose, our ethical principles, and our ethical standards. Some of these are in your book, and I've also included a website within the module so that you can look on it and go back through and remember and reflect on the various values and ethical principles of social work practice. So make sure you do that before the quiz at the end of this module. Flip through again the various values and ethical principles. So the purpose of the Code of Ethics is to identify and kind of summarize our core values. It summarizes our broad ethical principles and identifies relevant considerations when there are conflicts between ethical ideas or when ethical dilemmas arise. So the broad ethical principles, there isn't really a hierarchy necessarily to them, and so sometimes they come into conflict with each other. So we'll talk about here in a few slides some of the ethical principles, but I'll give you an example from my practice. When I work with older adults, some of whom hoard, I have to weigh some ethical considerations around their right to self-determination, their right to live in a house that is less sanitary than what I would like to live in. So I have to weigh this idea, this principle of self-determination, their right to live and choose how they live, even if I don't agree with it, versus the ethical principles of dignity and protection of life. And so I have to really balance and consider, I may not agree with this lifestyle, but they have a right to do it. But is there a point where I have to intervene because it now truly affects their health and safety? These are kind of ethical dilemmas that social workers often have to deal with. Right? It provides ethical standards of practice, so the ethics that we should do. Again, knowing and thinking about I need to respect the dignity of individuals and their self-determination. It also socializes practitioners to our mission, values, and ethical principles and standards. So again, particularly for those of you who are planning to go into social work, really spend some time going through the NASW Code of Ethics website and familiarize yourself with our values and our ethical principles. And finally, it articulates standards to assess unethical conduct. So just like other fields that particularly deal with the protection and of people, we have to have standards to decide when our another social worker's professional conduct is unethical. We need to, in order to move forward as a profession, we have to have standards that say whether or not someone has truly upheld and practiced in the best version of a social worker or not. And we have to have as well opportunities, options for dismissal or punishment, those kinds of things, if we find that someone has acted in an unethical way. So I'm going to go through the various values and broad ethical principles. So the first one is service. And the ethical principle associated with this is the idea that we should use skills and knowledge to help people in need and address social problems. This ethical principle also suggests that we should, as social workers, give of ourselves, donate some of our time, kind of much like lawyers do with pro bono work, that social workers should give some of their service or their time free of charge. Our second value is social justice. The ethical principle associated with this is the idea of working with oppressed and vulnerable people to challenge social injustice. Third, we have that we respect the dignity and worth of the person. And this idea that we see all people as valuable, even if they don't have the same values as us, the same views, they come from a different culture. We believe that all people deserve respect, and that we should, as social workers, should not only respect their dignity, but also should help work with them to identify and respect their own self-worth and self-value. Next, we've got the importance of human relationships. Sorry, these renumbered themselves, but this would be number 4. And the ethical principle associated with this is that we recognize the central importance of human relationships. So we recognize how important our relationship is with clients. We recognize how important it is to develop and foster our clients' ability to kind of connect with others, to develop nurturing relationships with other individuals. And that's a big part of our practice, is helping people really not only develop their own self-worth, but then being able to connect with and develop meaningful and healthy human relationships. Next, we have integrity, and this is the idea that social workers should behave in a trustworthy manner. And by this we mean that social workers should be upfront and clear with their clients. We shouldn't try to deceive them. So for example, if you're working with someone in practice, private practice, therapy, should inform your client as to why you're using this particular therapeutic approach, or why you think that this would be beneficial to them, so that they have informed consent. They're aware of why you're using this approach. And then we've got competence, and this is the idea that social workers should practice within their areas of competence, and that they should develop, enhance their professional expertise. So the idea behind this is that social workers come in with knowledge and skill base from their education. They should continue with ongoing education to enhance their skills in terms of whether it be therapeutic techniques or things like that. The idea is also that we don't practice outside of our skill set or our knowledge. So for example, if my training is in cognitive behavioral therapy, I should not then be trying to provide psychoanalytic theories or therapy to a client, because when I haven't been specifically trained in that. So, just like doctors, nurses, the medical profession, they're expected to kind of operate within their competencies. They are specialists in certain areas, and those specialists stick to those areas. It's the same with social work. The idea that we have those skill sets, we can enhance our skill sets, but we should be giving our clients the best that we have, which means not practicing outside of our expertise. So let's talk a little bit more about how these social work values kind of play out in real life. So as social workers, we believe in the inherent dignity and worth of an individual. And we do this, or we demonstrate this value, we uphold this value by allowing mutual participation with clients. So often as social workers, we try to work in collaboration with our clients, helping them, allowing them to set goals, helping them on their steps to reach those goals. We don't really try to dictate or apply a therapy to them. We give them kind of a say in what this therapy is and how it plays out and things like that. We also believe in acceptance. We recognize that our culture, our beliefs may be different from our clients, and that isn't necessarily a conflictual arrangement if we're willing to be open and learning from our clients. If we're willing to accept them for who they are, and recognize that we are helping them on their journey instead of trying to force our ideas and our values onto them. We also respect the confidentiality of our clients. So just like you wouldn't want your doctor, your nurse sharing your stories or what's going on with you with others, you wouldn't want your therapist gossiping about you at the local coffee shop. As social workers, we respect the confidentiality of our clients. Now, there are a couple cases where this may create an ethical dilemma. So, particularly around issue confidentiality when a client is at risk of harm to self or others. Now, as social workers, we're mandated reporters, depending on your agency, which means that we have a duty to inform authorities to get help for a person if we believe that they're at imminent risk of harm for themselves or others. And this kind of ties into honesty. And as a social worker, assuming your client isn't currently in crisis, we do want to be honest with our clients and inform them that we are mandated reporters, that we will keep the information they tell us confidential unless we fear they're at risk of harming themselves or others, in which case we will have to inform authorities. And I found that often clients understand this. There's often not a lot of pushback around that. They get that that you have a duty to report. And we also have responsible handling of conflict. So whether it's conflict with the client we're seeing, conflict between clients, we don't take sides, for example, if we're doing family therapy, things like that. And also responsible handling of conflicts within our agency. Now, we also have the idea of individuals having the right to self-determination. So we respect their right to make independent decisions and to participate actively in the helping process. So there will be times when, individuals may make choices that we don't necessarily agree are the best, but as long as they aren't truly harmful, they're not going to really affect the health or safety of the person. It's important to allow our clients to explore and to make their own decisions about what they want to do as part of the helping process. We also are committed to assisting our clients obtain the needed resources. So as we talked before, recognizing that an individual isn't really in poverty by choice. It's often that they don't have access to resources that they need. So how as social workers can we help connect them? And a lot of this has to do with having those conversations with the clients. We have to really talk with them and be open to learning from them in order to understand what resources we really need to help them access. Um, we strive to make social institutions more humane and responsive to human needs. This is part of our social change goals, right? We're not just trying to help individuals or help them necessarily access resources. We also want to impact their environments, and we want to impact their communities and larger social policies that are unresponsive to human needs, right? So policies that, actually aren't providing the resources that people need. Communities that are helping some individuals but not others. We as social workers are charged with going beyond just working with individuals to working with the communities and larger policy structures to address human needs. And again, as we said before, we want to respect and accept the unique characteristics of our clients. This isn't about dictating how they should be. This is about being willing to listen to others. And so this really comes into the idea of cultural competence and being able and willing to recognize that different cultures have different values and belief systems, that they aren't necessarily better or worse, but that we need to figure out how to work with them. How do we leverage the individual strengths in order to help them reach their goals? Right, and we have, in terms of our ethical standards, we have responsibilities to our clients, to our colleagues. We have responsibilities in practice settings. As professionals, we have responsibilities to our profession and to broader society. Now, the ethical standards are quite extensive, and neither your book doesn't go over them. However, if you are interested in learning more about the ethical standards, you can go to the website that I posted again in the modules, or you can go to the website that's linked here. We're just going to go over a few examples of responsibilities to clients. But I encourage you to take a look and see what the different ethical standards are around interacting and responsibilities to your colleagues in your profession, for example. And for those of you who aren't necessarily going into social work, it'd be interesting to see how some of these ethical standards might compare to your own field's ethical standards. So here's a list of the ethical responsibilities that we have to clients as social workers. So we have a commitment to clients, the respect for self-determination, informed consent, competence, cultural competence and social diversity, so respect for that. Focus on what to do in terms of conflicts of interest, protecting the privacy and confidentiality of clients, again, except when it potentially has people are at risk of harm to themselves or others. Responsibilities in terms of access to records, sexual relationships, physical contact, sexual harassment, derogatory language, payment for services, what we do when we have clients who lack decision-making capacity. So for example, if we have older adults who have experienced cognitive decline due to Alzheimer's or potentially some kind of traumatic brain injury, what do we do? How do we work with those clients who lack the ability to cognitively make decisions? Ethical responsibilities when there are interruption of services, and ethical responsibilities in terms of how we terminate or how we finish our services and relationships with the clients. So next, we're just going to focus on two of these ethical responsibilities, self-determination and competence. So before we go into an example of ethical dilemmas, I want you to take a few minutes and look through this ethical decision-making model. Now, there are various models out there in terms of how to make ethical decisions, what you should prioritize, and things like that. This is just one example. And so the first is the Identify ethical issues, including the social work values and ethics that conflict. Identify the individuals, groups, and organizations that are likely to be affected by the ethical decision. Tentatively identify all possible courses of action and the participants involved in each, along with possible benefits and risks for each. Thoroughly examine the reasons in favor of and opposed to each possible course of action. Consider relevant ethical theories, principles, and guidelines, codes of ethics and legal principles, social work practice theory and principles, and personal values, including religious, cultural, and ethnic values and political ideology. This is both for yourself and your client. Consult with colleagues and appropriate experts, such as agency staff, supervisors, agency administrators, attorneys, ethics scholars, and ethics committees. Again, this is an area where confidentiality, the issues around confidentiality may be you may be able to break confidentiality to some degree. For example, you may talk with your supervisor if you're in a particularly difficult situation. In a sense, you're not really breaking confidentiality as long as you have informed your client that you do talk about cases with your supervisor and things like that, because your supervisor is not going to go out and gossip about it. This is part of the internal review process, in which case you're not really breaking confidentiality. You are receiving appropriate feedback. Then you want to make the decision and document the decision-making process, and monitor, evaluate, and document the decision. And so this is a lot of ethical steps in the decision-making process. So let's look through 2 ethical dilemmas and think about the ethical issues that are at play and how you might address them. First, we've got Jackie, and Jackie attended an exciting workshop on the parentified child and has come to see that much of her work with women in recovery focuses on this issue. She has done reading on the concept and discusses it regularly over lunch with a colleague who shares her interests. Lately, she's begun to focus her work with her clients not only on their substance use and relapse issues, but on the childhood issues that she feels may be contributing to their addictive behavior. She feels that it would be unethical to continue treating the symptoms and not the underlying problem. Now, read through this again, and I want you to think through and answer these questions. Is Jackie violating the code of ethics? And what activities would assure you that she's met the standard of competence? So take a few minutes, write down your answers, and then go on to the next, or continue the video. Okay, so this is a particularly interesting case for Jackie. So is Jackie violating the code of ethics? Maybe, maybe not. Right? So she's attended a workshop, so she's gotten some training on this topic. But it's not clear how much training she's gotten, or how effective this approach is. So one of the ways that we would want to make sure that she's met the standard of competence is that we would want to know that she's actually researched this approach and this method, that this is actually scientifically backed and supported. Again, we as social workers, we don't just apply willy-nilly ideas and things like that. We apply evidence-based practices and approaches to our work. That's part of being competent. So just reading about a way to work with people or attending a single workshop really wouldn't be enough to be using this approach in particular. We would want to know that she has done extensive research on this and that this is a proven, efficacious approach to working with people. Right? We also see that she's still working with them in the traditional way, right? But she is including this idea, or these ideas around reflecting on childhood issues. So we know that in a way, she's not really violating the code of ethics because she's still giving them the appropriate practice, or she's still practicing with them in a way that her agency has dictated. She's just trying something new. So again, if we knew that she was that this approach was scientifically backed, and that she had really done her research on this, and had received training in how to do this, then there wouldn't really be an issue with competency. The other issue we would want to potentially address ethically is whether or not she's talked about this with her clients and whether or not they have agreed to participate in this approach. Right? Just because we feel that a particular approach or a particular therapy might be particularly good for our clients doesn't mean that we can force it on them, right? They should have a say when they're seeking assistance in terms of what we do. That's part of competence and part of the informed consent, that they should understand, her client should understand why Jackie is talking with them about childhood issues, and how she thinks this is going to help. The final thing we would need to consider is the potential trauma that talking about childhood issues could bring up for individuals, and whether or not Jackie is providing appropriate support for individuals who experience crisis or really negative, intense feelings as a result of bringing up childhood issues. So again, this is kind of, well, is Jackie violating the code of ethics? Maybe, maybe not. We would need more information in this case, but those are the things we'd look at. We looked at the training, the type of training she's gotten, how efficacious this approach is, whether she's talked to and gotten consent from the clients to do this, and whether or not she has a plan in place should she should her clients feel really traumatized from this approach to therapy. Next, we've got Jane, and she's a home health care manager. She's been seeing Mr. Smith for over a year, and he's a 55-year-old man with a spinal cord injury. In her last visit, Jane learned that Mr. Smith has stopped taking his blood pressure medication because it makes him dizzy. Now, Mr. Smith has promised that he's going to see his doctor soon to talk about changing to a new medication. So, what must Jane consider as she attempts to meet her ethical responsibilities? So take a few minutes and think through what are the ethical dilemmas here and what does Jane need to do to resolve them. And when you're ready, after you've noted down your responses, go on to the next slide. All right, so we've got a couple ethical standards or principles that have come into conflict here for Jane. So we've got the kind of conflicts around the health and safety, dignity, and rights of Mr. Smith, as well as his self-determination, right? So we've got Mr. Smith who's decided to stop taking his blood pressure medicine because it makes him feel dizzy. So he's actively making a choice to stop taking a medicine that he potentially really needs. And so Jane has to really weigh this this dilemma, right? You know, what's more important, his health or his right to choose? Now, it's not clear, you know, how long Mr. Smith hasn't been taking the medicine or how long he could go without serious health consequences. That would be something that Jane would really need to figure out in more depth. She would also really need to focus on this idea that Mr. Smith says he's going to talk to his doctor soon. Well, how soon? You know, does she have the responsibility to intervene and contact his doctor for him? Does she need to intervene and get him to a healthcare center immediately? Or does she respect his choice to not take the medicines and trust that he will go and see his doctor? In many ways, there are kind of no right and wrong answers with this. With just the information that's provided, right? Since we can't see Mr. Smith, we don't know if he's seriously ill from not taking his blood pressure medicine or how long he hasn't been taking it. So for Jane, if she really thinks that his life is in danger, she may have to make the choice to break confidentiality, to call an ambulance and get him to the hospital, or to contact his doctor. So you know, she has to really weigh that decision of his health and safety versus his right to choose what he does. And it's going to depend a lot on how Mr. Smith presents, what Jane really thinks is going to be the best approach to helping Mr. Smith. So again, ethical decisions often aren't easy. They're often context dependent. And so, as a social worker, we really have to consider and weigh what's presented to us. How important is it to break confidentiality versus respecting somebody's right to make a bad choice? At what degree do we intervene because we fear that their safety is at imminent risk? All of those things are the things that, as social workers, you have to weigh and you have to consider. And just like we saw in the ethical decision-making chart, if Jane truly believes that Mr. Smith's he's at imminent risk of, a heart attack or something like that, his health is at imminent risk, she may need to break confidentiality. She may need to call an ambulance. She may need to call his doctor. In which case, she would need to document this. Why she's taking this approach. She would need to try to get more specifics from Mr. Smith, how long he hasn't been taking the medicine and things like that. And then she would need to figure out a plan for what to do with Mr. Smith after he is stabilized, right? Often when we break confidentiality to protect an individual, that can really harm our relationship with them. Although sometimes it really benefits our relationship because the person realizes how much we care about them. And so then Jane basically in this situation has to think about, what's the next step after getting Mr. Smith stabilized? Can she still work with him? Can he still work with her? Does she need to transfer his case to a colleague? In which case, they need to sit down and talk about Mr. Smith. She needs to transfer his documentation, things like that. So again, rarely in our life as social workers are things ever easy. Even when you make the initial decision, there's a lot of other ethical considerations, a lot of other things that we have to think about as well. So that wraps up this e-class. Up next, make sure you've completed the self-assessment, the invisible knapsack, if you haven't already. Also, you'll be wanting to watch the special topic e-class and watching the TED Talk that accompanies that. For your next milestone, make sure you're collecting sources and data to support your call to action project. In particular, I'd like you guys to focus on scholarly articles. In particular, with some of the social justice topics you guys have chosen, news articles, they tend to be more about people's opinions rather than facts. So in particular, I'd like you to really look into what the research base, what the evidence base is around your particular call to action project. You'll be wanting to read Chapter 6 and attend that e-class. I'm going to post some examples of call to action projects so you get some ideas of what this could look like. And you're going to want to complete the Choose Your Own Adventure activity. I've got a bunch of good TED Talks for you to choose from that should particularly be interesting in terms of exploring more on race and racism in the US.